Number 8 is Anthony Phillips' first album, The Geese and the Ghost. Why? Because it's evident from this album that he was hugely influential on Trespass, which I've already mentioned. But he also uses Collins here as a singer and Mike Rutherford as the bass guitarist and 12 string. But also Rutherford co-writes a lot of the songs here. Phillips' music is quite interesting because it's clear the influence he's had in the early part of the band, and he retains that, but it's very bitty. He got later into soundtracks, but a lot of it has kind of got that folky acoustic feel, and he uses the stop, start, quiet, and loud thing going on, but in his case, it's kind of very clunky, whereas Genesis used to flow. The music would go high and low. This is kind of really clunky, but it's quaint, so it's definitely worth hearing. So that's my number 8, Anthony Phillips, The Geese and the Ghost. Phil Collins sings on this album as well, not just drums. And there's the CD version that came out later, which has a version of a song called Silver Song on it, which is not on the vinyl, but that's worth hearing as well. Right, okay, that was number 8. Number 7 is Peter Gabriel 4. So, yeah, he's pretty famous by then. Pretty famous as a beginning as a solo artist. Unlike Phillips, this sound on this album is timeless. It's super polished and incredibly accomplished. And unlike Gabriel's second album, it sounds really complete here. This is a really fresh sounding album. And sure, if you know it's from the 80s, you'd be able to identify it, but I just think this album sounds really fresh even today. It doesn't retain much of the Genesis sound, but it squeezes on this list regardless, because it's kind of not that long after he left the band, and I think the fan base was the same as Genesis. So those of us who were fans of Genesis, we know at the time we all bought this album. So it starts absolutely brilliantly, where you've got like this chanting. It's called The Rhythm of the Heat, the first track, The Rhythm of the Heat. It's got this tribal chanting going on, and it slowly builds and builds and builds and he's got this thing. Gabriel does this quite a few times. He has in his tracks, he has like this accelerating drumming. So it kind of starts kind of slow, and then it gradually speeds up, and this one builds up to a great climax and has this fantastic last, is it a bass drum or tom-tom, I don't know, but the last note, you can hear the decay. Really, really dramatic. And then the gorgeous San Jacinto, I Hold the Line. High Have the Touch is a bit slight. Family in the Fishing Net, a little bit indistinct. Shock the Monkey was kind of a dynamic kind of single at the time. Was a hit. Lay Your Hands on Me was a concert favourite. He used to put his arms outstretched with his back to the audience and fall back into the audience, and then was carried around the audience for the song, singing while he was kind of lying down, being passed from people to people, and then eventually make his way back on the stage for the end of the song. So yeah, I think Bono used to do that as well. Springsteen certainly did in later years, but Gabriel was maybe one of the first, at least to my knowledge, one of the first singers to do that. Really good album. Number 6 is this one. Collins again, Face Value. Now, this album was preceded by the single. Single came out, In the Air Tonight. This really fancy cover. So you can see here, it kind of talks about the band. Joining the band at Genesis, and you can see there he's got the Earth, Wind and Fire horns that he brought in for this, for the single. Well, not so much the single, but certainly for the album. Really, it's got the most well-known drum fill in rock and pop music. Tremendous. In the Air Tonight, but it's more than that, and you've got elements in here of Genesis, elements in here of Brand X. So he's not afraid, despite his pop sensibility coming through. You've got that instrumental, that creative stuff bringing a really varied sound. As I say, he brought in the Earth, Wind and Fire horn section, and they did their contribution is peppered across this album, but did a great version of Behind the Lines, which was the opening track on the Genesis album Duke. Really very, very different, and it really, really works. Yeah, great. And again, I think this is where it all came, his kind of persona, his writing, his lyrical style is all about his relationship breakdowns, first marriage, and If Leaving Me Is Easy, which is the penultimate track, is beautiful. It's an absolutely fantastic song. And then there's a version of the Beatles' Tomorrow Never Knows, which is, again, did excellent. So great effort. Now a super famous pop album, and a lot of people are a bit sniffy about Collins, but at this stage, I mean, I've liked Collins all the way through, but at this stage he was producing fantastic material, really good. So that's Face Value. So number 5, down to the top 5. I've probably been talking for half an hour already, but if you're still here, cheers. Steve Hackett, Spectral Mornings. Steve Hackett's third album and my number 5. This, firstly, the downside. He starts singing a bit too much on here, and there's a track here that closes side 1 called The Ballad of the Decomposing Man, where he sings, and it's truly, truly abominable. I think it's the same with, like I said, with Banks. Banks needed Gabriel, needed Hackett to challenge him, and Hackett also has too many people in his camp who don't push back, and so he can be a bit excessive. Nevertheless, there's some great beauty on this album. You've got The Virgin, The Gypsy's really good. The Red Flower of Tachai blooms everywhere. What a bloody song title that is. Lost Time in Cordoba, all very, very interesting, and lots of different sounds in there, and kind of calming, really nice. Has a fantastic opening track, Every Day, which kind of bursts forth. It's kind of a bit mid-paced, some pretty good multi-track vocals, to be fair, and then kind of breaks about halfway through into this stirring guitar solo, which is kind of multi-track guitar solo, which is highly dynamic, super melodic, and it just kind of flies away. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, not everybody likes it. He's a bit of an acquired taste, but I think it's an absolute career highlight. Every Day, and I think he still plays it on stage to this very day. Spectral Mornings closes the album, kind of marching, big guitar piece. Later, he did a version with the now sadly deceased lead singer from Big Big Train, David Longdon. Did a vocal version of Spectral Mornings, which was great, and that would have been a brilliant Genesis track as well. So that's my number 5, Steve Hackett, Spectral Mornings. Right, number 4, Mike Rutherford, Small Creeps Day, an unsung classic. Like I've said, he's kind of got a bit of an unassuming personality. Like I've said, also, he's a team player, and I think it really shows on this album. He was not afraid to involve some great musicians in putting this album together, and he didn't want to dominate. He seemingly had no desire to really dominate the sound. Now, that's not always the case. He produced an album later, the second album called Acting Very Strange, where he took on the lead vocal role, and that is truly awful, really, really bad. And I think he ditched the vocals straight afterwards and brought together Mike and the Mechanics with Paul Carrick and what's his name? Paul Young, not the Paul Young from Sad Cafe. But this album is really, really beautiful. It's got big keyboard washes in there. It's got some great guitar. He's got he brought in a singer had a bit of a jazz background, which is kind of strange. I didn't know at the time, Noel McCullough, but he sings beautifully on this album with great distinction. Excellent. All of the first side is like a suite of songs, and it starts very, very slowly, atmospherically, with between the tick and the tock. And it's kind of Small Creeps Day. It's based upon a short story, I believe, of a regular guy who lives presumably in the home counties in London, and goes off to London to work in an office all day long. Anyway, so it starts really slow and very stately, and then what bursts in is Working in Line, which is multi-track acoustic guitars and a great guitar solo. And considering Mike Rutherford's guitar performance on the album, and then there were three, which I thought was real substandard. Brilliant here, great fast guitar solo, and it goes through various stages of the suite and closes out with At the End of the Day, which is a really gorgeous track, beautifully melodic, and like I said, stately as well. And the whole suite is absolutely gorgeous. That is echoed on side 2 with Time and Time Again, but it's a bit more of a mixed bag on side 2. But as I say, that to me is a classic if you're into Genesis. And sadly overlooked these days. I bet most people don't even know it exists, but a great album, and that is my number 4. My top 3. Right. Steve Hackett's first album, made while he was still with the band, Voyage of the Acolyte. And I think because he was still in the band at this point in time, it retains a lot of the Genesis sound. Mike Rutherford plays bass guitar on it. He has flute from John Hackett, of course, which he used throughout his career. And Phil Collins sings on this album as well, beautifully. Not with the dynamism that his vocals later came to provide, but much more of the sweet vocal sound is present here. It is a really nice album, covered by his wife at the time, Kim Poor, and it's has a fantastic opener, very energetic, loads of instrumental sections on here. So at the time although he did have vocals on the first side ones, Closer the Hermit, he didn't destroy this album with his mediocre vocals. Ace of Wands is great. Then he has this long 3-part track, Hands of the Priestess, part 1, Tower Struck Down, which is really punchy, and then Hands of the Priestess again, part 2. It kind of closes it out. He's got Sally Oldfield as singing, very, very sweet, just like Collins on this album. Collins sings Star of Sirius on side 2, and it finishes with this long piece called The Shadow of the Hierophant. Very, very good album, very Genesis sounding album. I suppose anybody who's has been around for Genesis anything like as long as me will definitely own a copy of this album. So that is my number 3, Voyage of the Acolyte. But before I move on, it's worth talking a little bit about Hackett. Hackett's done more than anybody to keep the Genesis sound alive over the years. But a lot of his later stuff, his albums in the 80s and particularly the 90s and the early 2000s, they sound just, they're all the same template. Pick a little bit of, different paces, good use of dynamics, lots of instrumental sections. Let's pick some exotic sounds from elsewhere in the world, maybe the Far East or the Middle East or Africa, maybe South America too. He's always got this kind of eclectic sound mix, so his albums kind of sound, they lack coherence to me. And partly it's because he uses lots of different vocalists, particularly on the earlier albums, and then his own vocalists are so undistinguished. You kind of it just doesn't seem to hold together. But to be fair on him, he did keep the Genesis thing alive when the likes of particularly Banks wasn't interested. And he brought this album out. When was this one released? My goodness. This was Genesis Revisited. I can't remember when this was released because this is it didn't come out on vinyl when it was first released. Just got just got the CD version here. But you just hear it just brilliant, interesting and experimental versions of like Watch of the Skies, Dance on a Volcano, Firth the Fifth, For Absent Friends, Your Own Special Way, which I don't like, but a good version here. The Fountain of Salmacis, Know What I Like, which is overplayed, of course, in Los Endos. He's got some brilliant musicians on this album. John Wetton, Bill Bruford, Tony Levin, who played with Gabriel throughout his career, Chester Thompson on the drums, Alfonso Johnson on bass, Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, a few keyboard players, a bit of orchestral backing on this as well. So this is a really good album by Hackett. He got carried away, made too much money probably, and then produced Genesis Revisited Volume 2, which is far safer. I mean, this is even got Suppers Ready on it. 4-album box set, musical box, Can Utility and the Coastliners, 11th Earl of Mar. I mean, loads and loads of different tracks from the golden period of early to mid period Genesis. Again, used different vocalists here. Amanda Lehman, I think, is one of them. He uses Nad Sylvan, who's had kind of a bit of a prog guy from Scandinavia, and I didn't like his mannerisms on stage. He was all kind of like posturing, but he kind of sounds a little bit between the sound of Gabriel and Collins. But to me, he used to wind me up a little bit when he stepped up to the mic, and he butchered, in my judgment, not everybody's judgment to be fair, but in my judgment, he butchered. On one occasion, Supper's Ready, and halfway through Supper's Ready itself, I actually had to leave, which is uncalled for. But yeah, I saw Hackett many times over the years, as I've seen. I haven't seen Collins live on his own. I've seen him with Peter Gabriel. Saw Gabriel loads of times as well. But Hackett is a bit hit and miss. But yeah, good night out if you're into that sort of thing. So that's number 3. That's Voyage of the Acolyte. So let's get down to the best 2 Genesis solo albums. Well, which is number 1? Which is number 2? Which is number 1? Well, number 2, I'm placing Peter Gabriel 3. Now, Peter Gabriel 3 followed, obviously, Peter Gabriel 2, which was a kind of a very slight, rushed album in my judgment, as I've already talked about. This is fully realised. It's like a burst of creativity here. Some fantastic tracks. The theme of the lyrics is kind of a lot about like social isolation, mental illness. In the main, starts brilliantly with Intruder, kind of by Phil Collins on drums, and it's like Collins developed this thing that they called a gated drum. But I think this album was noted at the time for not having cymbals, so it has this kind of boom boom sound in the drums, and never more so than on Intruder. No self-control. So it's got this dark, claustrophobic feel, that first track, and it kind of sticks to most of this album. I Don't Remember is great. Did a beautiful song called Family Snapshot, which is ostensibly about, I think, the assassination of JFK, or a similar assassination, but from the assassin's viewpoint, and you get a real insight into the torture and the social isolation that the assassin has in this case, and kind of born of parental neglect in his early years. But it's very, very dramatic. That accelerating drum thing again going on towards the end, starts very quiet and then builds. Absolutely fantastic track. Games Without Frontiers, which is the first track on side 2 and was a big hit single. Kate Bush on vocals, backing vocals, and sounds like nothing else you'd heard before and nothing else since. I've never heard any album that sounds like this. It's truly unique. Peter Gabriel sound here. It closes off with Biko, his social justice, human rights, kind of where it all seemed to start, really. Steve Biko famously was a dissident in South Africa and was murdered in police custody. And at the time, Mandela was still in prison. But Biko was, a big news story in the 1970s. And Gabriel really brought that to the fore on this album, and this track, which kind of starts with this chanting, which I think was a recording from Biko's funeral itself, and then this stately drum pattern starts to build and build. And eventually you've got, when he played it live, you know, the audience would all be chanting Biko, Biko with arms, with a fist raised. It was absolutely dramatic and brilliant at the time. And as I say, I saw many, many times, and it became a little bit tiresome. It was always the big concert closer. But once you'd heard it 20 times or something like that, and years later it seemed a bit forced. It was kind of very newsworthy when he first brought it out, and really meant something to a lot of people. But you know, once Mandela was released from prison and became the great statesman that he did, it was this Biko track sounded pretty dated, and so I don't go back to this album as much as I go back to my number one Genesis solo album, which is indeed the first Peter Gabriel album, Peter Gabriel 1. Eagerly anticipated, full of variety here. Great hit single that opened the release, just released just before the album, Salisbury Hill, which is slightly slower than Working in Line from Small Creeps Day, but has a similar feel, acoustic guitar. Brilliant track. Opens up with Moribund the Burgermeister. Modern Love, which is a rock, big rock single, the second single after Salisbury Hill. Barbershop Quartet, Excuse Me, which is really only the only real strange track on the album. The side 2 starts brilliantly with Slow Burn, and then you've got Waiting for the Big One, which has a Randy Newman-esque vocal on it. And then the big London Symphony Orchestra comes in for Down the Dolce Vita, and then a really grand, dramatic track called Here Comes the Flood, which closes the album, which could have been a Genesis album, certainly could have been a Genesis track, could have been a Genesis track on Landlines Down on Broadway perhaps, but it's fantastic. And he did an acoustic piano version, or a piano only version of it, many times in concert too. But I keep coming back to this album. It sounds timeless to me, again, utterly unique, very characteristic of Gabriel. And he did versions of many of these tracks later on when he had the orchestral backing. But I've not included them here because I think he's so far gone as a member of Genesis by then. I don't think it warrants a place on the Genesis solo album list. In the same way, I've not included anything by Mike and the Mechanics or Brand X, which I'll talk about on another occasion. But here he's got some brilliant musicians. I mean, Robert Fripp was involved in this one. Tony Levin on bass, who was been with him throughout his career, and of course, big player within King Crimson as well. And he's got the dual guitars from Alice Cooper's band. Steve Hunter seems to be the one who was most prominent on the album, but you've also got Dick Wagner, American, so you probably pronounce it Wagner. Just great guitar on this album as well. A few guitar solos, but it has that Alice Cooper sound to it as well. Larry Fast on keyboards. So yeah, absolutely brilliant shows, live concerts during this early period, which were full of Genesis fans. So I think in the same way that Collins' career took off in pop, Gabriel's took off as well, especially with the album So, with Sledgehammer. It's brought in big new audience as well. But I think back in the day, the concerts by the band members there were very much dominated by Genesis fans. I think even Brand X concerts were mostly Genesis fans in those early years. So that is an exhaustive, maybe exhausting trot through the best Genesis solo albums. Some of you will agree, some of you won't. Some of you will say, well, why haven't you included the later albums? Phil Collins, I hate Phil Collins, he ruined the band, blah, blah, blah. But, that's kind of where I sit in terms of what I think are the best Genesis solo albums. And if you're relatively new to the band, this list is not a bad place to start building up your collection and explore them a little bit further. But for us diehards, that's the story of the Genesis solo albums. Thanks for watching, and I'm exhausted. I'll see you on the next one. Ta-da.